Presentation by Professor Adam Tooze, discussed by Professor Shlomo Mizrahi. The title of the presentation of the webinar is Ready for Business, How COVID-19 Shook the World and How Unfit Are We for a New Crisis. Well, Adam, let me say a few words about Professor Adam Tooze. Adam, you will all know him. He's an acclaimed scholar of the Great Financial Crisis, so very central analysis for the IMF with his book Crashed. He, of course, wrote several wonderful books. He is best known for his economic study of Third Reich, The Wages of Destruction, which won the Wolfson History Prize in the mid-2000s, and also a book on the First World War, The Deluge, which was published in 2014. Adam is a British historian, and so it's kind of not surprising that he's writing about all these big events. He's currently a professor at the Columbia University and director of the European Institute, and held previous professorship positions at Cambridge and Yale. He will present today his book, my most recent book that was just published, Shutdown, How COVID Shook the World's Economy. And this book provides us with a tour de force account of 2020. And it looks at all the issues that matter for the fund, like finance and business, who took the economic decisions, what are going to be the legacies of these decisions, and how prepared are we for the next crisis. Professor Shlomo Mizrahi teaches public policy at the Department of Public Administration and Policy at the School of Political Science at the University of Haifa in Israel. And he is published widely in the area of game theory applied to effective public administration and industrial organization. So his discussion of the book will give a sense of, the delicate links between trust, between governments and the private sector, households and firms, and how the COVID crisis has been managed with the country case examples from Israel, which of course has been a very interesting case, and that behaved in a way that often predated other countries. If okay with you, Adam, I would like to, instead of the standard presentation, just ask you a few questions. We have like 25 minutes because this seminar is going to last for 1 hour only, and that hopefully should give a sense of what the book has to offer, and your take on current events. A couple of ground rules. If you are not muted, could you please mute yourself, or we will mute you. Just pardon us, but sometimes there's echo and we can't hear the speaker. At the same time, this, as you heard at the beginning, this meeting is being recorded. So just be aware of that. And it's posted on LinkedIn, so it's basically a public event. So the first question, maybe I should kickstart with this. Could you just sketch quickly for us the journey that took you to write this book? You are a historian, and COVID is still ongoing, so it's not really, history. Of course, we can look back, and we are doing at the IEO an evaluation on the first year of the pandemic response by the IMF. So we're very much in line with you, but just give us, a few lines on your thoughts of what brought you here.
Well, thank you first for the introduction and for this opportunity, and thank you so much to Shlomo for agreeing to be a discussant. I'm enormously looking forward to his perspectives on the events of 2020. And like most people, it wasn't my plan. I mean, my plans were fundamentally diverted by the crisis. I was embarked and am now returning to writing a book about the political economy of the climate crisis, which, like many people, I regarded as the great anthropocenic challenge of our decade. I took that to be the arena in which the relationship between politics, capitalism, the economy, and the environment were at their most challenging and most urgent, and that's what I was addressing myself to. And then, and like so many other people, I was just fundamentally taken by surprise, shocked, somewhat humiliated, humbled, I would say, to recognize that I had simply not understood that alongside the climate diagnosis 50 years ago, broadly speaking, at the same moment in the 1970s, another group of scientists, also concerned with the relationship between the environment and the economy and our modern processes of modernization, had developed this diagnosis of emerging infectious diseases that was its own world of disaster preparedness, crisis response, that had a very parallel diagnosis of the way in which modern economic growth and modernization was destabilizing our relationship with our natural envelope, and had generated urgent crisis warnings, urgent demands for attention, and urgent appeals for us to take seriously the risks that we were running. But I, along with a huge number of other people, was oblivious, essentially, to the seriousness of the challenge they were posing. And I went back retrospectively, and looked at various types of risk mapping. And you cannot say that pandemics were not there. They were always there, but somehow mentally I had placed them in a disaster movie sort of genre of risks that people I wasn't taking seriously. And here was this event upheaving everything. And it affected me personally in a way that no previous crisis has. It's rendered my wife's travel business, she's unemployed effectively, or has had to find new employment, disrupted my family life like it did everyone else's. And found myself, as it were, enrolled in trying, along with everyone else, to spin the story of Crash, the book about the 2008 crisis that you referred to, forward into the present, almost involuntarily enrolled. And I take Shutdown to be that kind of an offer. I mean, there are going to be thousands of books written about 2020, and they're going to take various different angles from the side of public administration, from public health management. And what this book is attempting to do is to see, in a sense, is if we take out of sample data, if we take, as it were, this whole shock of information that hit us in 2020, how far the framework which I had elaborated for understanding 2008, which was a sort of hybrid of political economy, geopolitics, and so on, how it could be extended. And that was really the challenge that I found irresistible. As a historian, I mean, we were talking before we started about the anxiety awaiting the December the inflation numbers. But as a historian, I don't think I've ever expected to live through those Thursday morning 8:30 a.m. on the East Coast American labor market releases, the ones that showed 4.5 million, 5 million, 6 million signing on every week in late March, April. There was a sense in which if you weren't going to be roused to attempt to analyze and do this, then really nothing in your lifetime likely would. So anyway, that's what drove me towards it. And I regard it in the spirit of what you described as a sort of provisional stock take. What happened in this 12 months and how did we cope?
Right. I think it's, we know some of this, the IEO, but I think generally where we try to study lessons early on so that, as one continues to walk a difficult and slippery path, at least has some gauge and can crystallize some memories, because there's so much now overlaying, in events. It's very hard then to remember how decisions were taken and what happened and why and so forth. So let's go to the book itself then. Shutdown. Shutdown is the name I gave to the book. And there's a difference between lockdown and shutdown. We can go into that, but I would like to focus on the fact that, the title summarizes well the situation we've been facing for almost 2 years now. And of course, as the fund said in the early days, this is a crisis like no other. But what's surprisingly is that it's not because of the virus. And the virus is, of course, deadly, a small percentage of the population. But as you say in the book, there are much worse viruses for both contagiousness and infection fatality rate now. They're now around. And there's been far more lethal pandemics. So the big difference, as you also stress in the book, is probably twofold. First, that the big crisis really originated in government policies. So government this time decided to use the sledgehammer to stop this virus. And one could argue that this was the right thing to do, was not the right thing to do. There's a number of NBR papers now trying to, just looking at the economics of it, whether it makes sense, exposed, but exposed we're all good, right? But in any case, exposed, whether it makes sense to do this massive, measures, both in terms of regulations and in terms of economic stimuli. There will be consequences for future generations, forever, of what was done now. And the question, therefore, is, why such a global pattern of policies, and what is the relationship with the global financial crisis? You think that the fact that we had a crisis, not too long ago, 10 years, history isn't that long after all, did that spark maybe an overreaction, or was it the scare at the beginning, and was there coordination helped or propagated this panic? Just a sense of, I'm trying to paint it in the two colors. It could be a good response, or it could be maybe not such a good response. Looking from the benefit of debt and unemployment and the mental consequences and trauma that this has caused in relationship to the deadliness of this virus.
Yeah, this is the most profound question, and one that we will be wrestling with, as you say, forever after, because an entire cohort of young people, particularly in the emerging and low-income world, have had their education disrupted in ways that they are very unlikely to retrieve. And amongst more disadvantaged and precarious families, even in the advanced economies, the damage to the education of young people is going to be irreparable, I think. So we're going to see huge human capital loss. And so there is a profound responsibility here, which I take extremely seriously. But I think I would start from a slightly different position, in the sense that, the book is called Shutdown because I was very impressed by IMF data, which showed that, certainly as far as the advanced economies are concerned, the reduction in mobility, which we're going to use as a proxy for the response, the civil society's response to the crisis, long predated government interventions. So the book's called Shutdown because I think it's better to think of this as being a collective action, if you like, of society, civil society, of business, of workers, of governments, in response to this new and novel threat. But with that qualification in mind, I take your point absolutely, that it isn't the virus as such that is so terrible. It is our reaction that makes it into the drama that it's become. And how do we explain that reaction then? And I think there one has to have recourse to some sort of story about, if you like, the epidemiological transition of the mind, in the sense that a large swath of Eurasia, societies across the span of Eurasia, have convinced themselves, from China by way of India, it turns out, all the way to the West, and then, of course, on to the United States and down to Latin America, convinced themselves that even relatively small increases in mortality from unknown infectious diseases are unacceptable, basically, warrant a massive reaction, either societal or private or public. And that's the starting point, right? That we will not tolerate death from this kind of disease on any large scale. And if one wants to then rationalize that, I think the place to go is to say, well, it's because of the systemic importance of the healthcare system, which is really in the front line. And we all know the flattening the curve logic, right? The flattening the curve logic is, after all, not to reduce the number of deaths in the long run, though it may do that, but it's, as it were, to regulate the flow of mortality through an intact healthcare system, and that's what has to be protected. So that, for me, is the kernel of the entire logic, and that applied first, very dramatically, in China. And when that began to kick in, it sparked a private sector retreat to safety in financial markets, very visible from the last week of February, massive from the second week of March, which itself then took on such dramatic proportions that there needed to be a government response initially in the financial markets themselves, where we get the really big central bank action. And this is where I think, Nicoletta, your argument about, as it were, 2008 being a preface really does come into play, because it's quite clear that the men and women in the central banks around the world from the second week of March were playing out an old script on an even more massive scale. Now, we could talk about why they were doing that. And it wasn't private credit in the first instance, it was the US Treasury market. But that, I think, is where the 2008 lessons really come to bear. And then, as the public health disaster in the West manifested itself, and we did indeed move towards government-mandated lockdowns of various types, then the fiscal policy response, as it were, kicks in as the answer to that. And I think that's, as it were, for me, the chain of events. This is triggered by a collective sense that we will try and resist and fight this novel threat, however modest it is by historic standards. That then, as it were, launches a financial market reaction so severe that it does trigger the 2008 response from the central banks. And then with the novel lockdown policies, we need a novel fiscal policy response, which in itself is it's really not like anything we saw in 2008. It's much larger in scale and has, as it were, labour market, mechanisms that weren't used then. And then in a sort of retrospect and from 30,000 feet and from a functional finance point of view, it turns out that the monetary policy actions underpin the fiscal policy actions, though many of the key actors will deny that they have that kind of functional relationship to themselves, to each other. Central bankers in particular will go to their graves saying that they didn't do that. They did it because of the financial market action. So that, for me, would be the sequence. And I agree the net result of this, criticize it or not, agree with it or not, applaud it or not, historically speaking, stand back and look at it, and it's like nothing we've ever seen before. I mean, it is. And if it betokens a similar sensitivity to other shocks coming down the line, which could be much worse, it does indeed suggest a societal political system that is very sensitive, right? That's very prone to very large scale reactions to what are, historically speaking, relatively modest public health threats.
Martin Wolf, that you quote in the book, said, it's true, it wasn't the problem. It wasn't the shock, the virus, justifying the magnitude of the response. It was the fact that we could.
Yes.
We had the means to throw everything at this. And then that really begs, I think, two questions. So people die of all sorts of diseases every year. It's about 50 million people that die every year, including infectious diseases, but mostly preventable diseases. And so, in these countries which are rich, which are affluent, that can throw whatever they want at these diseases if they wanted, without creating, furloughs, without creating, dramas, without condemning generations to, a future of lower earnings that they would have ever earned. Mm-hmm. And so, that's the first question. I mean, why haven't we reacted to preventable diseases, like non-communicable diseases, throughout the time? And two, given the opportunity of spending and the multipliers involved here at this juncture, why so little done on climate? Isn't climate the biggest crisis? I mean, we started with this, that really confronts humanity. That's not a modest shock. That's the shock of all times, really the mother of all wars for humanity. And it seems like in this tremendous effort to respond to the virus, whatever caused it, whatever, group thinking, whatever, rationalization of it, then it would at least have made sense that countries took a big chunk of what they were throwing on the table, tax money, and put it towards, opportunistically towards curing or transitioning their economies into a more sustainable pattern. You discussed this in the book. What's your take on that?
So again, huge and crucial questions. I mean, I think your point about, as it were, the sort of double or triple standards that seem to be revealed by this reaction with regard to global mortality, I think is absolutely well taken. I take, as it were, the epidemiological, the mortality data, not just of the world, but of individual rich societies, to be a screaming indictment of social injustice, systematic neglect of obvious social problems. And they are, as it were, legitimate would be too strong a word, but like stable in the sense that we don't question them and we aren't forced to question them. Why do poor people die of preventable diseases in such huge numbers when relatively modest levels of spending could mean that they stayed alive? That's a question which we normally deal with essentially by displacing it, both globally and inside societies. And one of the shocks of 2020 is precisely that comes loose, and it unleashes an utterly incoherent debate within many societies. What 2020 exposes is that we really don't have agreed, in many societies anyway, agreed comprehensive modes of having that conversation, what we owe to each other, what is reasonable to expect from young people to reduce the mortality of old people, you know, down to the absurd minutiae, as we all know, of arguing about face masks in the United States and vaccines and so on. So to me, you know, one could stand back and read this as exposing a sort of crisis tendency, if you like. There's a profound vulnerability within modern societies because they do not have well established mechanisms for having this conversation. What is worthwhile? How many trillions of dollars in future income should we sacrifice so as to reduce the mortality of people over the age of 75 with pre-existing conditions by X%? We don't have that, nor do we have, as it were, the means to arbitrate the proliferating counterfactual arguments, which are, well, if we do allow those people to die, how will it destroy the health system? What will then, you know, we don't have very good mechanisms for having those conversations. And in a sense, that continues directly to the climate problem. The same is true about the climate problem. One of the things that enabled the action to be as large, the fiscal action, the monetary action to be as large scale as it was in 2020, was precisely that it was conservative. This is one of the key arguments of the book, right? That you can, as it were, spend virtually limitless amounts of money, 2020 shows, if the aim of the game is simply to maintain the status quo. Like, if that's all you're doing is basically just keeping people whole, you can build very big societal bargains to do that on a very large scale. As soon as you say, oh, too good a crisis to waste, let's do something useful with it, the contention starts, right? That's exactly when you, as it were, then run into politics, which no one at that point wants to arbitrate or have that conversation. Speaking about the United States, which bulks very large in all of these calculations. When you break down the numbers of who actually borrowed what to do what, if you break down the numbers of who actually spent what on stimulus, the United States is not maybe even half of the total spend, or close to it, certainly a very large fraction. And as we all know, in that particular society, the move that you're suggesting from a status quo preservation, conservative crisis reaction to a hell, we should use this to address the climate problem is unthinkable. You can't even do it now with a different political complexion. So we're caught in a very uneasy tension, and that's one of the messages of the book. I mean, the book is as much a warning to my friends on the progressive and left side of politics to say, don't misread what happened in 2020, because you could come away from 2020 feeling very empowered. You could come away from 2020 thinking, oh my God, look at this extraordinary empowered fiscal monetary sovereign that steps into the breach and addresses society's problems. And it's like, I want to kind of stop the video at that point and rewind and take you back to the beginning and show, well, no, that's not actually what's happening here. What enables the door to be open to these spectacular actions is in fact essentially a profound conservatism. It's not at all obvious that it demonstrates, beyond an existing and pre-existing political commitment, which you do see, say, in Europe, that it enables that step. In Europe, I think you can follow through the logic of your argument quite nicely to a point, right? Next Gen EU looks as though it's precisely the sort of piggybacking response that you're talking about. But I don't think you can generalize that.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. It's very tricky to go from one to the other, but you know, we saw that at COP26, and for a lot of people that was a glass half full, and I think those questions will come back and soon, and so I think these actions which have been taken now almost could risk prejudicing the actions that we need to take to avoid further crisis. So I don't want to go much into further crisis. That's too depressing. And I think we're still in a crisis. I feel we're still in a crisis because we moved from the virus, which is now declining globally, as we know, in terms of contagions and deaths, to the vaccine wars. And I don't want to even go into the vaccine wars because, of course, that is creating a new sense of uncertainty, I think, in a lot of countries. I mean, we have governments falling, we have people not sure about, whether they can move, whether they can work, whether they can, what's in it for them. And some people even say, well, this is, there's something going on, in the back. We don't understand this global movement. But I think something more central to the book, which I think doesn't is very interesting for a fund audience, is the relationship between the crisis and domestic policies and world order, the geopolitics of the crisis. So in Crash, you analyze that for the global financial crisis, and here again you go and look at the geometry of geopolitics entering the crisis, and then speculate about what might happen. Can you give us a sense of that a little bit?
This has been a bit of a journey, to be honest, in the sense that when I wrote Crashed, it felt a little bit outre, a little bit risky to insist that there had been a geopolitical dimension to 2008 and its aftermath. I remember thinking long and hard about whether I was going to do that, whether that would put you in the kind of margins of the conversation, whether it was worth pointing out, for instance, that just weeks before Lehman failed, the war between Georgia and Russia took place, or that there was a financial backdrop to the tensions in Ukraine. And now it just seems commonplace, right? So there's a sense in which, as it were, what felt like something that, as a historian previously of 1914 and the interwar period, the 20s and 30s, where finance and geopolitics were intimately connected, it felt, as it were, as though one was forcing the envelope a little bit to introduce that with regard to 2008. Now, as you say, it's on everybody's agenda. And if you look back, in fact, at the fund's forecasts for 2020 in January and February 2020, before COVID dominated the agenda, that was top of stack for you folks. Right? What was top of stack was the possibility that geopolitical tension between the United States and China would escalate and destabilize trade and destabilize investment. And there was quite a lot of rather sophisticated econometrics being done in 2019, I'm sure you'll remember. And some of it then continued to be published into 2020 on the uncertainty effect and the uncertainty impact of the looming trade wars on global investment and the manufacturing sector. And we were talking about a recession in some of the more export-orientated economies of the world in 2019 for this reason. So that risk has been there, was there. But on the other hand, there was also a degree of optimism, right? Because there'd been the phase one trade deal, and Trump seemed to be in a rather upbeat mood about China. And early on in his reactions to COVID, this in fact showed through. And then there was this lurching escalation of a type that I think is very dramatic, and to my mind, has fundamentally changed the game in a way that is very difficult for those of us who are economically minded to really wrap our heads around, because the outcome of that is a full-blown quasi-militarization of America, the principal axis of America's relationship with China. And I think that's step by step, and it was not foreordained. Already in 2017, major strategic documents are coming out of the Pentagon and the National Security Establishment in the United States, which are mapping America's relations with China in those terms. But I think it's quite contingent to a degree that they exploded in the way that they did in 2020. It has to do both with dynamics on the Chinese side. Hong Kong, in particular, was a forcer of China's authoritarianism, but also the ebullience that comes out of having stabilized the situation. But much more manifestly, I think, we see a profound domestic crisis in the United States, which we are not out of the woods over. We're in a sort of hiatus currently, in my view. And we are, through, say, Woodward's report on General Milley's relationship to the nuclear deterrent, we're beginning to see into the abyss of uncertainty that actually opened up at the part of American power in 2020. And in that context, relations between China and the United States escalated in an extraordinary way. And in the economic sphere, what matters most is clearly the microchip escalation, which amounts to the Americans effectively trying to redline China's industrial development, which is unacceptable from Beijing's point of view, tantamount to a kind of low-level declaration of economic war on China. And that is not something that the American government apparatus can easily pull back from, and nor is there any will to do so. In fact, one of the few things that Washington can agree on is the bipartisan shift towards backing an escalation with China. And I think that's really a historic break. It's a break with the paradigm that has prevailed in Western relations with China since the 1990s. It's a generational break. And we are nowhere near really seeing the conclusion to that. I mean, there are ongoing arguments, within Wall Street, within big money in the United States. The two things which have burst into the open so far are the spat between Soros on the one hand and BlackRock and Blackwater on the other, and then Blackstone, sorry, and then most recently in Bloomberg, I don't know whether you saw, but this extraordinary story about ructions within Bridgewater, Ray Dalio's hedge fund, with different levels of management profoundly disagreeing with each other about the take they're going to take on China. And for a historian, political economist, to see these kind of tensions within big American money blown into the open in this way is truly something I never anticipated seeing, because it points to a profound lack of clarity about strategic direction for large-scale investment, which, as we know, was pivotal for large-scale wealth strategies over the last couple of decades, that no one could afford to be outside China. And now it's very unclear whether you can afford to be in China, or what terms you will be in China on. So that, to me, is a wholly new ballpark. How this plays out in areas of extreme importance for global economic governance, in which, of course, the fund, is caught in the crosshairs, as we saw as well this year, is very unclear. And I always come back to the 2015-2016 moment, the closest thing we've seen so far to a China crisis blowing back into the global financial system. And I think we all know, regardless of the rumors around, Janet Yellen, that at the very least tacit cooperation between the Fed and the People's Bank of China was crucial to managing the tensions at that moment. And how that would work out, in the world that we're currently in, I don't think we know. And that's because we've never, there's nothing in the track record of the last couple of decades, and there's certainly nothing in deeper historical experience of how you manage profound, highly militarized antagonism between two players of the status of China and the United States in the context of massive financial and economic integration. And that implies that I don't take the 1914 analogy seriously, which maybe we can talk about more. But that's the situation we're in, and I think it's very precarious.
I want to ask you a short answer to last question, and then I want to pass on to Shlomo because time is running. I'm aware of that. So generally, from an economic perspective, from the current situation, do you see clear winners and losers? I mean, we mentioned some sectors, of course, but there's a profound restructuring have to occur in employment, with this disease taking a toll. I don't know who in this webinar has been in a hospital recently, but the new normal is tragic. I mean, hospital, and it's not COVID. It's like, because of mental health, because of cardiovascular skyrocketing, excess mortality in some age groups that were healthy for whatever reasons. Clearly health sector seems to be the benefiting, perversely one, and of course pharmaceuticals. But there are also other things happening, hybrid work and, travel changing, and trade, and of course supply chains under stress and under restructuring. Do you see some clear winners and losers, not to talk about the echelons and the percentiles of the income population, but just generally?
Well, I mean, I think the sectoral winners are the platform businesses, obviously. I mean, I think that's sort of banal, but it's worth saying. And that was really a staggering kind of revelation of 2020, the extent to which those businesses had become de facto public utilities and were being basically presumed as an infrastructure that we were going to rely on in protracted, social distancing situations. The obvious loser is the travel sector, which we easily treat, because it's sort of our vacation thing, as a little luxury on the side. But if you believe the numbers from the industry itself, it's 10% of global GDP. Now, of course, those are business numbers, so they've inflated them. But there's no question that it's a high single-digit share of global GDP. And for many emerging and low-income countries, it's an essential industry. And I don't think there's any doubt in my mind that in due course demand will bounce back. We've seen that repeatedly. But the question, of course, is how much scarring there is in that sector. And it could be quite profound. So if we allow that as like 7-8% of global GDP, that's a big slice. And the healthcare sector, I think, is rather ambiguous, actually. I mean, 2020 is the first year in 60 years in which American health spending contracted, unbelievably. It's the first, it's in amongst the sectors which suffered the largest fall in GDP in 2020. The healthcare sector stands out in the US. It shed jobs.
We should distinguish maybe between health sector and pharmaceuticals.
Yes, absolutely, precisely. So it's a very complex organism. And to go back to your earlier point, as it were, it lives off our regular morbidity and mortality, right? It lives off the regular pattern through which rich people get sick and then slowly die, spending more and more money as they progress towards the final point. Americans spend on average $250 billion per annum on their final year of life. So as that cohort dies, it spends $250 billion every year. That is the routine, as it were, flow of funding as people go over that final cliff. Now, if you introduce something like a pandemic, which totally disrupts that final stage of life care, it disrupts a very, very large economy at 17% of American GDP. And it will reorganize itself. And there are definitely new market segments and there are new things that you can sell. And there will indeed be more distressed people in due course. But it's been hugely disruptive to that sector. So it's, I think, and to the labor force in that sector, if you look at quit rates, the famous Great Resignation, it's heavily concentrated precisely in those kind of frontline activities, because it's one thing to deal with the normal burden of disease and death. It's quite different to deal with what we've been dealing with recently. And it's not over. Thought you were a little too sanguine on that. Mortality right now is 7,000 people a day worldwide from COVID, and those are low side official estimates. So we are not out of the woods there, I think, by any means. Anyway, long answer again.
No, it is declining globally. I mean, that's the number, percentage number. But of course, it's dispersed across countries and continents. So if you look at the US, I think in the US it's falling too. In Europe it's not. But I think maybe I haven't seen the last numbers, and I shouldn't be quoting this because they are official. I would like to. This was lovely, and I would just like to go to Shlomo quickly, who has 15 minutes to go through his material. I think you had a little longer, but if you can condense it, so maybe we can get a couple of questions from the public. Shlomo, you have the floor, and you're sharing some slides.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, I have a presentation, so I'll just put it on. Okay, this is it, and this is okay. So thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss this very interesting book. What I am going to do is, first of all, critically present some of the ideas in the book, at least as I understand them, and then I would like to show some kind of perspective from the public management or political economy aspect. I try to go very quickly on some of the things, both because we don't have enough time and both because some of the things were already mentioned. So let us start. So first of all, I think that the book offers a fascinating historical analysis of the development of the global crisis during 2020. It is very rich with details, thought-provoking, and very fluent and readable. So with no hesitation, I would recommend anyone to read it. There are many takeaways from the book, but if we want to show some kind of the core argument of the analysis, I would present it as the following figure. We start with some kind of neoliberalism ideas which dominated for many years the systems. This led to the politicization of the systems, meaning that the government retreat from intervention and from the responsibilities for service provision. This led, according to the book, to organized irresponsibility, a term that was borrowed from Beck's analysis. As a result of this irresponsibility, governments actually left everything for the market. And when the crisis came, governments failed to deal with the crisis effectively and rapidly. However, they responded with massive government intervention, and it still remains to see whether we are back to the big government. So this is a very briefly the sketch of the core argument as I understand it. The book argues that the massive intervention was conservative in nature, striving to preserve the status quo, as mentioned in the talk earlier. And as a guiding principle, neoliberal ideas have not lost momentum at the elite level, at least as it is presented in the book, and I agree to a large extent. Now, what I think is not very clear is the move from organized irresponsibility to massive intervention, which remains, to me at least, unclear. And especially it is not clear why and how weak public sectors, which are poorly equipped, as the book rightly states, can do the job. And I think that here we have some kind of gap between the tools and what they actually try to do. And later on, I will try to show what are the results of this gap. So this is a sketch of the argument. And now let us see what at least I see as some kind of missing point in the argument. The book suggests an historical approach that deals mainly with elites and top-down analysis, marginalizing two main aspects of the socio-political development of recent years. And the first aspect that I think is missing is the citizens, the public, society, which are relatively absent from the analysis. However, these are players that can be hardly ignored, especially in times of crisis. In crisis literature, for example, they argue that what determined that the scope of the crisis is not so much the disaster itself or the virus in our case, but the readiness of the society. So the solidarity and so on. So as long as we don't treat with the society and the public and the citizens, we miss some kind of link, which is very important to understand also the elite level. Economy is about expectations. People expected something to happen. People expected that science will give answers to what is going on. And without treating the expectations, we cannot understand really what is going on, also at the top level. Now, the second aspect is the digital revolution, or big data, artificial intelligence, social media, and fake news. All of these are not playing a major role in the story, but I would like to argue that these are very important, both because the monopolistic power of the big IT companies, and both because these platforms offer completely new opportunities to communicate and handle such large-scale crises. For example, I think that you earlier you talked about why the intervention was so massive and so on, and why a virus that was not so caused not so much damage, why so much intervention and panic? And I think that one of the main reasons is the social media. because people see everything. They see in a minute, they see all what is happening in a hospital in Italy. And they see how people are left to die and so on and so on. Things that were not there earlier in history. So I think this narrows the world, and everything becomes very close. So you cannot ignore these aspects. Again, the global shutdown has hardly been bearable without such platforms. In fact, digital revolution have changed the ways politics is done and citizens' view about politics and government. So I would stress this aspect in maybe in future writing about this era. So now, very briefly, I would like to present some political economy or public management perspective, also presenting some ideas or results from the case studies we had in Israel. So basically, in public management perspective, in the core of the analysis of the relations between society and government stand three main aspects. First of all, coordination type. Hierarchical type, market type, and network types. The hierarchical is the traditional type. Market is the neoliberal type. And what happened in recent decades that in the movement between the hierarchical and market type, a new type emerged, which is a network type. And in network type, it is not neoliberal one, but rather the government is both regulating, but also providing services. It is both a player and a regulator. And this is a different structure than market and hierarchy. So we should analyze this movement between the types of coordination. Second, trust. Trust is a very, very important aspect in the relation between society and government. Actually, it stands at the core of the social contract. And we talk about interpersonal trust, social trust, organizational trust, institutional trust, which means trust in government, in democracy, in law. We can add trust in social media, trust in science, and all of these are very important in understanding what is going on. And finally, the process variables, which are, for example, accountability, participation, responsiveness in economy. There is a tendency to focus on outcome variables and stress the outcomes and outputs. But in public management, we show how process variables are so important to increase trust and coordination. And therefore, we should also focus on them in the analysis. So what we see here is a very briefly the sketch of different sketch of the history of the government failures in the recent decades, and very shortly what we see here is neoliberal and new public management reforms, which were leading to failures in adaptation and adoptions, leading to accountability failures, and that led to searching for a new balance between coordination types and emergence of network type coordination. So neoliberalism on the ground for several decades is no longer dominates. The gap is that in the economic elite, it still dominates. And I think that this is a main gap and this connection between the elite and what is going on the ground. Now, governments continuously fail to provide services which lead to citizen dissatisfaction, and this leads to gradual decline of trust at all levels, of all types, and increasing alienation and anti-politics. I would like to argue that this is one of the main reasons for the failures of the government with dealing with the crisis, because this leads to coordination, disorientation. Government simply didn't know what to do. They are used to leave everything for the market, or not taking responsibility, but suddenly they see that the market does not provide the answers, and they didn't know what to do, actually. And the result was a panic. So governments failed to deal with the pandemic effectively and rapidly. However, that led to massive intervention focusing on outcomes. And as I will show in a minute, because this focus, we will continue to see failures and decline of trust. So very quickly, what we show in Israel, we have done a series of studies before and during the pandemic using a public management perspective, and we examined the factors influencing citizens' attitudes towards the government in terms of perceived crisis management effectiveness, willingness to pay, willingness to comply with government policies, trust, and so on. Now, the findings demonstrate that during crisis, citizens focus on the short term and seek immediate results because they have a lot of fear that there is a lot of uncertainty there. So they look for short-term result in terms of readiness and effective government services. During such times, government responsiveness and transparency, as well as public participation in decisions, seem even more important than the trust in government. So, and these, I would like to remind you, these are actually process variables. So what people are looking for is immediate results, and this can be achieved through process variables rather than outcomes. And as long as a government stick to the outcomes, they will not be effective in building a new social contract or establishing it again. Now, the policy implications are that in times of crisis, public officials and policymakers are expected to become more responsive to the public by demonstrating fairness and transparency in decisions and trying to include citizens in their decisions. You mentioned earlier the vaccination and so on. And in this aspect, this is very, very important, the transparency, the fairness, and people are looking for this process variable. The public sector should invest in providing ongoing quality services at all times, because citizen satisfaction with public services contributes to effective crisis management. So if you ignore or neglect other aspects and concentrate only on the health system, you will probably lose a lot of citizens on the way. So try to look all around the services government should provide. Government should improve the managerial skills of emergency organizations, particularly with regard to the readiness and flexibility of healthcare organizations, which are at the forefront of handling crisis. And I don't know if I have time, but maybe 1 or 2 minutes. A final question: to what extent we're ready for a new crisis and why? I'm not sure that the book provide a certain answer for this question, especially for the why question. I would like to argue that there is a significant gap between the neoliberal principles that still guide economic elites and what is happening on the ground, where neoliberalism have lost momentum for almost 2 decades. Coordination disorientation gave rise to the idea of governance instead of government, and other constructs such as hybrid government, public-private partnership, sharing economy, as well as black market economy. Now, it was existed all the time, but it gained legitimacy through these processes. Such a gap intensified the trust crisis and the public alienation from politics at the high level. And finally, I would like to offer 2 main reasons to argue that the world is hardly ready for the next crisis First of all, the reasons that have led to the crisis have not changed. Coordination, disorientation, and declining trust still prevail. The second one is government mainly look at improving outcomes and emphasize top-down techniques of incentives and enforcement. They hardly try to improve bottom-up processes and use indirect regulative monitoring, including participatory mechanisms. There are indications that such an approach may improve coordination and trust, as for example, in coordinated economies. So I would like to argue that as long as governments stick to the enforcement, incentives, top-down technique, and neglecting the bottom-up processes and investing in indirect monitoring, participation, and all accountability and so on, we will still have what we see now, and therefore these are the main policy implications for government to take on this analysis. I will stop here.
Thanks, Shlomo. This was very insightful, at least for me. And if Adam have some reactions off the bat, and we have a few minutes left, just a few. There aren't questions in the chat, so.
Oh yeah, thank you so much, Shlomo, for that fascinating reading and reaction to the book. It's extremely instructive. I will plead. I recognize the book. I recognize my book in your description of it. I had a crisis over the summer of 2020 and I thought my deadline was even sooner than it turned out to be for submitting the book, as to whether or not I ought to have a large chapter about the tech side of the story. And me and my editors decided that the timeline was so pressing, and given my relative lack of expertise in that area, that it was a bridge too far. So that's why it's not there. I entirely concede the centrality of that. I'm struck listening to your comments by how far the circles of debate and discussion that I'm in are shaped by, in a sense, our ongoing preoccupations that go back to the 2008 crisis and the Eurozone crisis. And one tracks down a certain sort of line of professional preoccupation, and it shapes what your focus is, and the book reflects that. So I meant it in a non-trivial sense when I said that this was, as it were, one take on 2020, and I really eagerly look forward to this extraordinarily rich history also of public administration. I'd love to exchange more. I need a primer from you on what I should be reading, because I think that's clearly, as you put it, in sort of on the ground dimension of governance as it actually is worked out in people's lives. Your story seemed very compelling to me. I would say in defense, and I don't mean it to sound defensive, perhaps it's more just an area of agreement, that I completely agree that for about 20 years, perhaps slightly less in the financial sphere, but approximately 20 years, I agree that the broad principles of what used to be self-confidently called the Washington Consensus have been under pressure. And I have a chapter in the book on the emerging markets and on Latin America in particular, in which I try and address precisely that. And I call it the toolkit. In IMF terms, my friend Geeta Gopinath has this paper, and I'm sure folks from your side were involved in this, on the integrated framework, as she calls it, or the BIS, as it were, showcased this in 2019 in one of their annual reports on the wide range of new techniques which have been developed by emerging markets exposed to high globalization risk. And in fact, Israel was one of the first to deploy and to build some of these instruments for managing globalization risk from the position of relative marginality within the global financial system. So you're not top of the stack for access to Fed swap lines. So how do you build? And then, in fact, we move in the financial sphere into exactly the kind of terrain that Shlomo was highlighting for other areas of administration. And the rubric under which this travels is macroprudentialism. And macroprudentialism I would think of as being precisely a kind of hybrid governance strategy, which is, as the name suggests, part macro, part prudential, part regulatory, and the whole genre of economics, macro financial economics, which is also new in this period and attempts to bridge this gap between macroeconomics on the one hand and financial economics on the other, is the reflection in this sphere of the tendencies that you're talking about. But absolutely, admittedly, from the zone of high finance, high global finance, rather than from the area of public administration or vaccine administration or the registration of sick people in cities around the world. And there's certainly a gap that divides my work and this world from that other world and studies of that other world. And it would be amazing to see how one might begin to bridge those gaps. I certainly don't do it in this book. It's very, to that extent, part of why it moves as freely as it does is that it moves, as it were, peak to peak to peak, and that is undoubtedly also a restriction of its vision. This was fantastic. Thank you so much for that reaction. I really appreciate it.
And thanks to both. We have a strict policy to finish on time, so it's 1 o'clock. I'd like to thank again all the people that followed the webinar, but in particular Adam for being with us and being so generous with his time and his ideas. And it's a great book, and I'm almost through it, so it's a recommended reading for economists, I think, who want to understand more and get a good snapshot of what happened and have it handy. And to Shlomo for the very insightful analysis on the disconnect between what is happening and where people going and thinking, and the trust nexus, which of course is essential to any democracy that wants to call itself a democracy. So thanks so much to both, and wishing you a good lunch or dinner or cocktails or wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much again. See you soon.